Before we begin, there's no need to remember anything. Simply relax your body and mind, slow your breathing, and let this tranquil tale gently lull you into slumber. Recalling childhood, you might picture rosy cheeks, days spent in bed, or an ordinary fever. Yet throughout humanity's long history, the truth was far darker. A silent gamble played out in dimly lit rooms. Indeed, had we lived in those times, most of us would never have survived childhood. Now let us journey further back through the river of time. This tale did not begin with feverish children or rashes behind ears, nor did it originate in nurseries or schoolyards. It emerged much earlier from the slow, profound convergence of a virus and a new species. It began with cattle. Picture ancient shaggy herds of cattle roaming the vast Eurasian steppes. Among them lurked a virus, a deadly pathogen later known as rinderpest. Over eons, this virus evolved silently, eventually engaging in a new game with a wholly different creature. The story began with cattle. The virus's long evolutionary journey began with a completely different animal. It began with cattle. Picture ancient, shaggy herds of cattle roaming the vast Eurasian steppes, harbouring a devastating pathogen that posterity would name rinderpest. For millennia, a brutal equilibrium persisted between virus and host. Around 10,000 years ago, human existence underwent a profound transformation. We abandoned nomadic life for agriculture, cultivating land, and sowing crops, domesticating wild animals. Goats, sheep, calves. We tamed these wild cattle, we erected fences living alongside them, sharing water sources, breathing the air within their pens. Thus, unwittingly, we invited their diseases into our own for viruses. This presented a golden opportunity. Pigs, having tamed wild boar, built pens to live alongside them, sharing water sources and breathing the air within their enclosures. Such actions inadvertently introduced their diseases into the human world. For viruses, this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. As simple replicators, viruses perpetually seek new realms. Cross-species transmission is a formidable evolutionary hurdle. For millennia, the rinderpest virus may have repeatedly attempted to breach human defences only to fail. Shepherds might contract the disease through contact with infected livestock, yet the virus ultimately reached a dead end within them, unable to spread further. Yet over vast stretches of time, evolution plays a numbers game, and humanity was about to fundamentally alter the odds of this contest. The agricultural revolution yielded food surpluses, which in turn spawned unprecedented urban centres. Settlements like Uruk swelled to tens of thousands, densely packed, within cramped quarters of rudimentary sanitation. These became paradises for pathogens, a sea of warm bodies sharing the same air. Around the 5th century BC, within one such bustling metropolis, the cowpox virus underwent mutation. A minute random alteration in its genetic sequence enabled it not only to infect humans, but also to replicate efficiently within the human lungs, ultimately spreading through coughs or sneezes. Thus measles was born. This novel human virus had a specific requirement. It depended on human populations for survival, necessitating a constant supply of previously uninfected hosts. Once recovered individuals gained lifelong immunity. They vanished from the pool of potential hosts. Within small tribes of mere hundreds, outbreaks would swiftly infect everyone before fading due to host scarcity. For measles to become a permanent fixture, it required vast populations, cities or urban clusters of at least 250,000 inhabitants, alongside a steady stream of newborns. With the rise of ancient metropolises like Babylon, Athens and Rome, the measles virus took up residence. Its chosen habitat was not the open steppe, but the crowded alleys of human civilization. It became an inevitable rite of passage in childhood, a seasonal visitor in winter. For the ancient Romans, a childhood untouched by measles was scarcely conceivable. The virus had become woven into the fabric of life itself. Each year, new infants arrived, and every few years an epidemic would sweep through, claiming a terrifying toll. Survivors carried the memory etched into their immune systems, and the cycle repeated. For centuries, this rhythm was simply the norm of existence. This affliction, dubbed the Red Plague, was a familiar shadow often confused with its more terrifying cousin smallpox. Merely one among many fevers and rashes, it was not until exceptional minds emerged in a certain city of learning that the truth was finally discerned, and this ancient spectre named Time flows to the 9th century, transporting us to the resplendent heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad. This city of 1,000,000 souls teemed with libraries and hospitals, where scholars translated ancient medical texts and debated knowledge. At the pinnacle of this scholarly sanctuary stood the brilliant physician Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known in the West as Razi. He was a philosopher and alchemist, and above all, an exceptional clinical master. Presiding over the great hospital of Baghdad, he held firm to observation and empirical evidence, rejecting superstition, and devoted his life to medical research. Ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known in the West as Razes. He was a philosopher and alchemist, and above all an exceptional clinical master presiding over the great hospital of Baghdad. He held firm to observation and empirical evidence. He rejected superstition, spending hours at patients' bedsides, recording every detail with a scientist's eye. In Baghdad's fever wards, al-Razi confronted a puzzle that had baffled physicians for centuries. The chaotic combinations of diseases that produced rashes most dreaded was smallpox. Yet during his meticulous rounds, al-Razi discerned a pattern. He observed that not all rashes were identical. Certain patients, particularly children, suffered from distinct types of illness. Though equally severe, their disease trajectories diverged markedly. He resolved to document these differences, establishing guidelines for distinguishing between diseases. This culminated in a medical masterpiece, a treatise on smallpox and measles. For the first time in history, measles was formally and unequivocally differentiated from smallpox. It was no longer considered a milder variant of smallpox, but a distinct disease with its own clinical features and progression. This was no conjecture, but the insight of a scientist's treatise on smallpox and measles. For the first time in history, measles was formally and clearly distinguished from smallpox, no longer a milder variant of smallpox, but an independent disease with distinct symptoms and progression. This was no conjecture, but the crystallization of rigorous observation. Rereading his descriptions today remains astonishing. Their clarity spans the chasm of centuries. He detailed early discomforts, nausea, anxiety, and bodily heaviness, high fever, swollen eyes, and back pain, and for the first time noted violent coughing, hoarseness, and nasal congestion. He understood this was not merely a skin rash, but a disease originating deep within the body and spreading outward. Subsequently, he described the rash itself, contrasting it with smallpox. He wrote, "Smallpox pustules are deep and isolated, forming hard scars within days, whereas the measles rash, he observed, was different, densely clustered, like tiny pimples merging instantly to cause the skin to turn red and flushed." He noted the rash typically began on the face and behind the ears, then spread across the entire body. He even witnessed the minute flaking of skin during recovery. Beyond clinical signs, he proposed a theory grounded in contemporary medical theory and personal observation. The rash represented the body's attempt to expel pathological substances from the blood. Though his mechanism was erroneous, his clinical insight was exceptional. He conceptualized measles as a predictable process with distinct onset, progression, and resolution, thereby charting a diagnostic and therapeutic roadmap for physicians. His writings detailed fever management protocols, hydration with barley water coupled with rest, and proposed soothing remedies for coughs and eye pain. He specified intervention timings and guided the identification of critical complications like pneumonia. This contribution was monumental by naming measles and charting its course. Razi transformed it from a mysterious terror into a known disease. Translated into Latin, his work became a millennium-spanning medical text. Physicians from Isfahan to Paris would examine a child's rash through his lens. He provided the primary weapon in the fight, precise identification. He laid the foundation for future understanding, separating the shadow from its twin. With this intellectual courage, he wrenched measles from folklore and placed it beneath science's lamp. The disease's nature was now clear. Yet as humanity entered an era of global interconnectedness, its ancient transmission patterns were about to be violently overturned. This age would transform the childhood ailment of the old world into an apocalyptic scourge. For millennia, measles had circulated solely within Eurasia and Africa. It migrated at the pace of walkers, camel riders, or coastal vessels spreading silently among caravans along the Silk Road. Its diffusion was slow, taking centuries to infiltrate new populations, fostering a painful symbiosis, yet the world was about to shrink. The age of exploration commenced in the late 15th century as European powers set sail in their thick-hulled vessels, equipped with navigational instruments to circumnavigate the globe. These voyages not only linked continents, but became conduits for commodities, ideas, and even microorganisms. This was the Columbian Exchange, a vast unintended migration of plants, animals and cultures, the most devastating of which was sturdy ships and sophisticated navigational instruments embarked on a journey to connect the world. These voyages stitched continents together, opening pathways not only for goods and ideas, but also allowing microorganisms to spread unchecked. This was the Columbian Exchange, the vast unintended dissemination of flora-fauna cultures, and most devastatingly diseases between old and new worlds. Indigenous peoples of the America's Pacific Islands and Australia had existed in biological isolation for millennia, their civilizations rising and falling untouched by Eurasia's evolved pathogen communities. They knew no smallpox, no influenza, no typhus, no measles. In the stark terminology of epidemiology, their immune systems were like virgin soil, immunologically naive. When the first European ships arrived, the biological weapons unleashed proved far deadlier than any cannon. The initial strike was often smallpox. The 1520 pandemic devastated the Aztec Empire. Yet smallpox was merely the initial assault. Measles frequently spread in the second or third wave, its devastation even more insidious. While smallpox struck terror and death across all age groups, measles behaved quite differently among these uninfected populations. It was not merely a childhood disease, for adults possessed no immunity, rendering everyone susceptible. Measles swept through communities, instantly claiming every life. More insidious still, smallpox struck fear into people of all ages, but among these immunologically vulnerable groups, measles exhibited different characteristics. It was not merely a childhood disease, for adults likewise lacked immunity. All were susceptible. It engulfed entire communities, instantly striking down everyone: farmers, mothers, hunters, priests, chieftains. Imagine a village in the highlands of 16th century Peru. Rumours of a new disease reach from the coast, a fever accompanied by a red rash. An infected merchant brings it into the village. Within a week the first cases appear. Within 2 weeks the entire village is paralysed. Unrelenting fevers, incessant coughing. News of a new affliction spreads from the coast, a high fever accompanied by a red rash. A weakened merchant carried the virus into the village. Within a week the first cases appeared. Within 2 weeks the entire community was paralysed. Unrelenting fevers, incessant coughing, even glaring light became unbearable. But the true catastrophe lay in the collapse of daily life. No one fetched water, tended fires, or prepared meals. Crops rotted in the fields. Infants fell first, then the elderly. Finally, the able-bodied death often came not from the virus itself, but from dehydration or secondary infections, illnesses that ravaged weakened bodies. When entire communities fell ill simultaneously, social functions ground to a complete halt, collapse. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across the American continent. From the moment Europeans made contact, waves of epidemics dominated by measles swept through indigenous populations. The scale of demographic collapse was staggering. Within a century of Columbus's arrival, the Americas' population may have plummeted by 90%. This was not merely tragedy, but a strategic factor in colonial conquest. Empires already weakened by smallpox were further hollowed out by measles and other diseases. This created power, vacuum-shattered social structures, and precipitated spiritual crises. The invaders, immune through childhood exposure, traversed dying villages unscathed, as if shielded by their own deities. Disease not only facilitated conquest in myriad ways, but became its primary instrument. This pattern extended beyond the Americas. When European expeditions reached the Pacific, similar tragedies unfolded on a smaller scale. Isolated communities were abruptly connected to the global microbial network. Consider Fiji in 1875. The archipelago had just been ceded to the British Empire chief Latu Seru Epenisa Kakobau of Fiji. Accompanied by two sons, visited Sydney, Australia at the invitation of the colonial governor. Sydney was then experiencing a measles outbreak, and all three unfortunately contracted the virus. Unaware that they now harboured the deadly pathogen, they sailed back to Fiji. After recovering, the entire island held grand celebrations with chiefs from neighbouring islands arriving to welcome them. This proved the perfect opportunity for transmission. Within enclosed spaces, the virus spread silently and efficiently. Over the following 4 months, the 1875 Fijian measles pandemic claimed over 40,000 lives, representing 1/3 of the population. At the time, entire villages were utterly devastated. Deaths occurred so rapidly that traditional funerals could not be performed, while survivors too ill to tend their withering taro fields abandoned them to decay. A pall of death descended upon the archipelago, broken only by wails piercing the silence. This demographic, social and cultural catastrophe left Fiji struggling for generations to recover. These unvaccinated populations revealed measles' true nature. On the crowded old continent, it preyed like a predator on captive game, exacting a fixed tithe from each generation of children. Yet when unleashed upon entirely susceptible populations, its ferocity knew no bounds. This underscores the profound intertwining of human history and the history of disease. The boundaries on maps, the rise and fall of empires, the global balance of power, shaped not only by armies and economies, but also by a virus that leapt from cattle millennia ago, determining destinies at a microscopic scale. The entanglement of human disease history, the frontiers on maps, the rise and fall of empires, the global balance of power, these are shaped not only by armies and economies, but also by the microscopic workings of a virus that leapt from cattle to humans millennia ago. This virus travelled the world on the breath of explorers, reshaping the globe in its own image. Before the needle, before the cool swabs of alcohol, before the silent miracle of vaccines, measles was never a choice, never a debate, but an inevitability. A shadow over every cradle, a debt childhood must repay. In 20th century urban jungles from Brooklyn to Manchester, the virus ruled the family calendar. It arrived as autumn's chill, a seasonal visitor that only departed with spring's return. Mothers in 1950 needn't worry whether their children would catch measles, only when it would come. The disease was so rampant, so ingrained in human existence, that over 90% of people had contracted it by age 15. It was a universal experience, a collective plague dream. This familiarity bred a peculiar, dangerous fatalism. Measles became a rite of passage, a term that sounds almost charming until you consider its meaning. This rite entailed a week or two of agony, a cough so violent it tore at the lungs, eyes so swollen they had to be shielded from light, and fevers so high they approached 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit, plunging children into delirious wastelands. Then came the defining symptom. The rash first fine speckles appeared behind the ears and on the forehead, then spread like a relentless crimson tide engulfing cheeks, torso, and limbs until the child's entire body was covered in mottled spots, a testament to the virus's complete conquest. On the soft inner lining of the cheeks, tiny white specks resembling salt grains on a red background appear. Koplik spots the distinctive hallmark of measles. Any physician trained to recognise them can confirm the diagnosis. For most, this bleak journey concludes with a gradual recovery. The fever subsides, the rash fades, and the child gains lifelong immunity. This predictable outcome gave rise to a peculiar phenomenon when the epidemic raged. People felt uneasy. The spots, measles' distinctive calling card, were unmistakable to doctors familiar with the sign. For most, this sombre journey concluded with a gradual recovery. The fever subsided, the rash faded, and the child gained lifelong immunity. This predictable outcome gave rise to a peculiar folk remedy, a desperate public health gamble played out on living room porches, the measles party. Its logic was brutal, yet pragmatic, since the disease seemed inevitable and young children experienced milder symptoms. Parents deliberately exposed healthy children to infected ones. It was a gamble akin to rolling the dice, deliberately inviting the pack hoping their hunger remains unquenched. A swift resolution, an attempt to control the uncontrollable. This was a strategy born of desperation, a fragile shield raised against biological inevitability. Yet familiarity masked the beast lurking within. Measles is no mere childhood ailment but a systemic invasion. Its true peril lies not in the rash or fever but in the complications, those brutal aftershocks. The virus is a master of suppression. While replicating frantically, it wages a silent war against the immune system, precisely targeting the very cells meant to defend the body. It induces temporary yet complete amnesia in the immune system's memory cells, erasing the memory of past infections. Measles survivors temporarily revert to an immunological state of naivety, once more exposed to the threat of all pathogens in their environment. This opens the door to secondary invaders, most commonly pneumonia. A violent dry cough turns wet, the lungs filling with suffocating white foam. Memory cells suffer a temporary yet profound memory loss, erasing the immune memory of past infections. The recovered child is immunologically reset to a primitive state, re-exposed to all pathogens in the environment. This opens the door to secondary infections, most commonly pneumonia, where bacteria invade the damaged lungs, transforming the dry cough into a wet wheeze accompanied by rasping breaths. In the pre-antibiotic era, this often signified a death sentence. Even in the 1950s, when penicillin emerged, it remained a life-threatening illness filling children's wards. In any year before vaccines, measles hospitalised tens of thousands. Then there were ear complications. Middle ear infections were a common companion to measles, occurring in up to 1 in 10 cases. Bacteria ascended the eustachian tube, causing excruciating pain and sometimes permanent hearing loss. Thousands of children became partially or completely deaf from this disease, which society regarded as a rite of passage. The virus could also directly attack the eyes with painful conjunctivitis, potentially triggering bacterial infections, leading to corneal ulcers. In malnourished regions, particularly where vitamin A deficiency was prevalent, this caused scarring and permanent blindness. Globally, measles was the leading cause of childhood blindness, robbing hundreds of thousands of children of their sight. Conjunctivitis may trigger bacterial infections, leading to corneal ulcers. In malnourished regions, especially where vitamin A is deficient, this can cause scarring and permanent blindness. Globally, measles is the primary cause of childhood blindness, robbing hundreds of thousands of their sight. Yet the most dreaded complication haunting parents and doctors alike is encephalitis. In approximately 1 in every 1,000 cases, the virus invades the brain, attacking the central nervous system. This non-infectious encephalomyelitis represents a catastrophic inflammatory response. Children seemingly on the road to recovery may suddenly develop a persistent high fever progressing through stages of lethargy, agitation, convulsions, and ultimately falling into a coma. The brain tissue begins to swell. Among measles encephalitis patients, 15% will die. Of the survivors, a further 40% will suffer permanent brain damage, epilepsy, intellectual disability, deafness, or paralysis. In the decade before vaccines became available in the United States, measles claimed approximately 400 to 500 lives annually, predominantly children, while over 1,000 more endured permanent brain damage. This is the true cost behind the rite of passage, the invisible casualties concealed within statistical averages, lives silently claimed by this common disease. Welch author Roald Dahl knew this pain intimately. In 1962, his 7-year-old daughter Olivia contracted measles, which progressed to encephalitis and ultimately claimed her life. This fatal twist of a routine illness mirrors tragedies befalling hundreds of families year after year. Casting a deeper shadow is another rare, yet more terrifying spectre. Subacute sclerosing pan-encephalite (SSPE). This fatal degenerative brain disease, though not a direct complication, represents a long minor tail effect. Even years or decades after a child appears to have recovered from measles, viral remnants lurking within brain cells can reactivate. They begin a slow, irreversible destruction of the brain patients experience, subtle personality shift, followed by cognitive decline, seizures, and ultimately complete loss of motor control. This condition is invariably fatal, like a time bomb planted in childhood. Its fuse length unknown. This was the baseline, the accepted reality in an undefended world. This airborne pathogen penetrated almost everywhere, leaving a significant proportion of survivors with death, deafness, blindness, and neurological damage. If this represented its impact during wartime stability, its behavior during actual warfare was starkly different. It became not merely a childhood plague, but a strategic weapon of devastating power. The American Civil War, though marked by numerous firsts in combat, also served as an unplanned, large minor-scale biological experiment, the deadliest killer born either gun nor uniform. It was the measles virus. When the call to arms sounded in 1861, hundreds of thousands of young men answered. Many hailed from remote rural areas, farmers, sons from the Appalachian Mountains, pioneers of the prairies, hermits deep in the forests. In these scattered settlements, they had never encountered measles, possessed no immunity, and were as vulnerable as infants. War logistics gathered these youths together. They were crammed into vast training camps, huddled in tents, sharing blankets, cups, and even the air they breathed. Hygiene was utterly disregarded, creating the perfect breeding ground for airborne viruses. When measles was introduced to camp by recruits from a city, the outbreak did not spread, it detonated. Entire regiments were wiped out before a single shot was fired. Army doctors penned reports of utter despair. In the winter of 1861, the troop assembly near Washington was ravaged. Confederate medical records show that 500 out of 800 men in one regiment fell ill simultaneously. This constituted a big crisis when a third of the force was rendered combat-minus unfit by persistent fever and weakness too severe to stand. Generals could not plan offensive. Persistent fever, weakness too severe to stand. This virus became the enemy's force multiplier, depleting manpower, crippling logistics, and shattering morale. For every soldier killed in battle, to perish from disease, measles was the chief culprit. Not the direct cause of death, but the fatal catalyst. The virus suppressed young soldiers' immune systems, leaving them defenseless against other camp-mine-borne pathogens. The true executioner was pneumonia. The violent coughing fits triggered by measles and the cold nights often heralded a soldier's final struggle as fluid filled their lungs. Records from one Union division show that out of over 2,000 measles cases, 300 developed pneumonia, with 105 fatalities. The casualties inflicted by a single virus within a divisions surpassed the losses of many minor, yet renowned battles. Consider the Vermont Regiment arriving in Washington. Over 1,000 healthy farm boys, full of vigor. Within months, measles swept through the camp. By war's end, 153 soldiers had fallen in battle, while another 145 perished from disease. Measles and its complications were the primary cause of this grim toll. The situation was identical on both sides. Overburdened medical teams were powerless. Though isolation tents were established, intervention often came too late. 5 perished. Measles and its complications were the primary cause of these grim figures. The situation was identical on both sides. Overwhelmed medical units were helpless though isolation tents were set up. They were often too late against a virus infectious for days before the rush appeared. They could only alleviate symptoms, bed rest, warmth, hydration, and ineffective concoctions of whiskey and quinine. Powerless against the virus itself, they lacked effective weapons against secondary bacterial pneumonia. All that remained was to watch, tally the dead, and sign death certificates. The measles virus lurked like a spectre within the military machine, this silent destroyer, claiming more lives than flanking menus or relentless advances. This was an invisible, indomitable foe. It revealed that military mobilization was both a political and a biological event. Until the 20th century, every major conflict repeated this lesson. The deadliest enemy on the battlefield was often invisible to the naked eye. For centuries, this adversary persisted like a spectre. Humanity could perceive its ravages but not its form. Formless and shapeless, it roamed among households, towns, and armies to hunt down the spectre, capture it, and compel it to reveal its secrets. A new kind of warfare was required, not fought in trenches, but in the sterile silence of laboratories. This campaign demanded patience, rigorous procedures, and profound insight, waged by scientists armed with microscopes and glass pipettes, driven by the conviction that what can be understood can ultimately be conquered. Early attempts in the 1752. The Scottish physician attempted to inoculate measles using patient's blood, akin to early smallpox inoculation. He achieved limited and hazardous success, sometimes inducing mild illness, that the method proved unreliable and perilous. He disseminated the full wild virus without the tools to comprehend his adversary. A century later, in 1846, Danish physician Peter Paul, NUM, was dispatched to the remote Faroe Islands to investigate a devastating measles outbreak. The islands had seen no measles since 1781, leaving an entire generation without immunity. When the virus returned, the epidemic raged across the islands. NUM undertook exceptional detective work, tracing the transmission path village by village by village. He documented that no elderly individuals who had contracted measles in 1781 fell ill again, confirming lifelong immunity. More significantly, by tracing the virus's transmission routes, he precisely calculated the incubation period from exposure to rash onset as exactly 14 days. He had fitted the phantom with a clock, defining its behavioral pattern. Yet the phantom remained invisible. Its final capture awaited the advent of modern virological tools. By charting its movements, he precisely measured the incubation period, exactly 14 days from exposure to rash onset. He fitted the phantom with a timepiece, defining its behavior. Yet the virus itself remained invisible. Its final capture awaited the advent of modern virological tools. The breakthrough did not stem from measles research, but from the battle against poliomyelitis. In 1949, a team at Boston Children's Hospital led by John Enders, in collaboration with Thomas Weller and Frederick Robbins, achieved a revolutionary breakthrough. They demonstrated that the pulvivirus could replicate in non-minus nerve tissue cell cultures, cells maintained in nutrient broth tubes. Researchers could now observe the cytopathic effect as the virus invaded and destroyed cells. This achievement opened floodgates for virological research and earned them the Nobel Prize. Cultivated in non-minus neural cell cultures, they could observe the virus invading undestroying cells, the cytopathic effect. This breakthrough unlocked virology research and secured them the Nobel Prize. They constructed a stable enclosure where the invisible viral beast could be contained for study. The stage was thus set for capturing the measles virus. Leading this endeavor was a young physician named Thomas Bebel from Ender's laboratory. During the winter of 1953-1954, a measles epidemic swept through Boston. Enders keenly seized the opportunity, dispatching Thomas Bebel to collect samples from infected children in an attempt to capture the measles pathogen using the novel tissue culture technique. Peebles visited multiple institutions, but his visit to a Massachusetts boarding school proved decisive. Among the sick boys, he identified an 11-year old named David Edmonds. The child was in the early stages of fever, exhibiting only mild symptoms. Peebles collected throat swabs and blood samples. Back in the laboratory, the arduous work began. They inoculated the samples into human kidney cell culture medium, placed the culture tubes in an incubator, and regularly replaced the nutrient medium. Day after day, they waited and observed. Yet nothing happened. On the 9th day, Bebel noticed a change. The cells began to cluster together, fusing into large, multi-inculate monstrosities. These giants in serial cells exhibited a distorted, dying morphology. This was cytopathic effect. Yet, unlike pulvivirus, it bore the virus's unique imprint, its footprint. Naturally, they had to prove it. They extracted fluid from this culture to infect fresh cells. The cells were grotesque, dying entities. This was cytopathic effect, yet distinct from pulvivirus. It was the virus's unique imprint, its footprint. To confirm, they extracted fluid from the culture to infect fresh, healthy cells. The same bizarre destruction ensued. Repeatedly passing the pathogen from the culture to new cells proved its ability to replicate. The ultimate proof came when mixing the culture with convalescent patient serum, rich in antibodies. When this mixture was injected into fresh cells, there was no reaction. The antibodies had neutralized the pathogen. This was the decisive evidence. They had successfully captured the virus. The final proof came from mixing the culture with convalescent patient serum, rich in antibodies. When this mixture was injected into new cells, no reaction occurred. The antibodies had neutralized the pathogen. This was irrefutable evidence. They had captured the measles virus. David Edmonds' Tun sample thus became the Edmonds-Tun strain, the progenitor of nearly all subsequent measles vaccines. In 1954, John Enders and Thomas Peebles published their findings. After millennia of plague ravaging the land, through ages of terror, through the shadow of armies decimated and children's lives stolen, the virus had finally been cornered. It ceased to be a spectre, becoming instead a tangible entity within test to be cultivable, studyable, manipulous, and crucially, attenuable genetic code. The capture operation was successfully concluded, and the scientific war was formally declared. The quest to capture the spectre began with a trap. For centuries, measles remained an elusive, intangible foe. To combat it, one must first capture it not merely from the lungs of feverish children, but to confine, study, and disarm it within a controlled environment. This trap was fashioned from blackened nutrient media. The trap's creators were, in truth, pursuing another monster, the poliovirus. It was within the laboratories of Boston Children's Hospital that this scientific war truly commenced. The virus had to be imprisoned within a space where it could be studied and rendered harmless. The trap was fashioned from blackened nutrient medium. The trappers were pursuing another beast, polio, in the laboratories of Boston Children's Hospital. John Enders, Thomas Weller, and Frederick Robbins rewrote the rules of virology. The prevailing consensus held the pulvivirus could only replicate within nervous tissue, rendering research exceptionally challenging. Enders rejected conventional wisdom, insisting on patient observation. He led his team in experiments others deemed a waste of time, injecting pulvivorous samples into human embryonic skin and muscle cells maintained in simple test tubes, then placing the tubes in a slowly rotating drum to gently agitate the cells in their nutrient broth. They waited patiently, a laborious, almost agricultural process. Success was signaled by subtle color shifts. The phenol red indicator in the nutrient medium appeared pink when cells were healthy. As the virus multiplied and killed cells, the acidic substances released by the dead cells turned the culture to a characteristic yellow. They termed this the cytopathic effect. This marked humanity's first opportunity to observe viral activity without microscopes or sacrificing monkeys. They opened a window onto the invisible world, cultivating pulvivorous within glass flasks, without microscopes, without sacrificing monkeys. They opened a window onto the unseen world, discovering a method to cultivate polio within glass flasks. It was precisely this elegant circumvention of a decade-long conundrum that earned them the Nobel Prize in 1954. This discovery unlocked doors for Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, paving the way for the polio vaccine. Yet the key they forged could open more than one lock. In the very year, the Nobel Committee honored their achievements. A fierce measles outbreak struck a Massachusetts boarding school. Thomas Peebles, a young physician in the Enders laboratory, sensed an opportunity. He drove to the school with a newly developed technique, navigating through rows of coughing, feverish boys in the infirmary, searching for the perfect specimen. Ultimately, he found his target in 13-year, old David Edmonston Peebles. Peebles took a throat swab from the boy and returned to the laboratory to perform what was now almost routine, cultivating human kidney cells in pink nutrient medium, injecting David's throat washings, and waiting once more. Days later, the first signs of mutation appeared, that this was no simple cell death. Through the microscope, Peebles witnessed the cells entering a bizarre state. They no longer died individually, but fused together. Their membranes gradually dissolved, ultimately coalescing into the monstrous multi-incholated entity known as a cisnitium. Peebles observed, through the microscope, as the cells exhibited bizarre behavior. They did not die individually, but merged together. Cell membranes gradually dissolved, culminating in the formation of a colossal multi-incholated monster known as a cisnitium. They resembled sprawling giant amoebas, with dozens of nuclei scattered haphazardly within the monstrous cell. This was the virus's calling card, an irrefutable microscopic signature. It was the one they had caught it. The spectre that had haunted humanity for millennia was finally captured, pinned to a glass slide, growing obediently in a Boston laboratory. The strain was named after its provider, the Edmonston strain. The trap had been sprung, but the arduous task of taming this beast had only just begun. As the Edmonston strain was stored in the laboratory freezer, a new contest commenced. This was a delicate and perilous contest of domestication, a battle of taming. The original virus was a leafless assassin, inducing full-blown measles upon injection. The challenge lay in creating an attenuated virus, a tamed, weakened version. It must stimulate the immune system to produce lifelong antibodies, yet be too weak to cause severe illness. It must become a shadow of its former ferocity, a training partner rather than a lethal adversary. The method was serial passage in flasks, a means of accelerating directed evolution. John Ender's team took the lead, cultivating the virus in human kidney cells. Once replicated, they took minute samples to infect new batches of cells. After 20 for such cycles, they altered the culture medium and transferred the virus to human amniotic cells. Within this environment, the virus underwent transformation into another form. A minute sample inoculated a new batch of cells, repeating the cycle 20 for time. Subsequently, they changed the culture medium again, transferring the virus to human placental cells, where it underwent a further 20 for passages. With each passage, the virus adapted to the artificial culture environment, generating mutations. Viruses demonstrating slightly superior replication capabilities within laboratory cells would outcompute homologous viruses. After dozens of generations, the virus gradually became a product of laboratory cultivation. The final crucial step involved transferring the virus to chicken embryo cells, where it underwent 22 for additional passages. With each passage, the virus adapted to the artificial environment, undergoing mutations. Virus strains with a slight advantage in laboratory cells would outcompute their counterparts. After dozens of generations of evolution, the virus transformed into a laboratory-specific organism. The final crucial step was its introduction into an human environment. They began passage through chicken embryo cells. As the virus mastered infecting chicken cells, it forgot how to become an efficient human pathogen, gradually losing the key to breaching human cells. This constituted a protracted, gradual education process. After 20-8 passages through chicken embryo cells, they obtained an attenuated strain named Edmonds-B. Trials commenced on children in 1961, demonstrating the vaccine's capacity to induce robust immune responses and prevent measles. Yet this beast remained partially untamed. Edmonds-B retained some virulence, causing high fevers in most children and mild measles, like rashes in about 1 in 3, though far less toxic than wild measles virus. The side effects were concerning. Doctors were advised to administer a second injection alongside the vaccine, gamma globulin antibodies from recovered patients. This second shot acted as a brake, dampening the immune response. Like rash, it was far safer than wild measles, but the side effects were concerning. Doctors were advised to give the vaccine with a second injection of gamma globulin antibodies from recovered patients. This second shot acted as a brake, dampening the reaction. It was an effective but clumsy to step solution. In 1963, this combination vaccine became America's first approved measles vaccinale and marked yet imperfect victory. While Enders pursued his work in academic laboratories, others took a different path. Certain companies developed inactivated vaccines, cultivating viruses that had been chemically killed. As the virus was no longer active, it did not cause fever or rash. Initial trial results were promising, and in 1963 the inactivated vaccine was also approved for market release. Yet it harbored a fatal flaw. The immunity it conferred was both weak and fleeting, lacking activity. It failed to induce fever or rash through replication. Initial trial results were encouraging, and the inactivated vaccine gained approval in 1963, but it concealed a fatal flaw. The immunity it produced was feeble and transient. Worse still, it could trigger dangerous allergic reactions. Children vaccinated with the inactivated vaccine who subsequently encountered wild measles virus experienced catastrophic immune overreactions, resulting in atypical measles syndrome, persistent high fever, unusual rashes, and severe pneumonia. This dead end stands as a cautionary allegory for the immune system's complexity. What appeared a smooth path was actually strewn with hidden reefs. The ultimate refinement. The global standard vaccine emerged from the hands of Maurice Salmon, the 20th century's greatest vaccine developer. This scientist at Merck, a pharmaceutical giant, possessed a rugged, pragmatic character, immense drive. He was a finisher. When examining the Enders-Edmonds-B strain, he discerned both its brilliance and its flaws. He was convinced it could be optimized to be safer and more perfect. After acquiring the strain, Schillermann's team pursued relentless research. Over 40 passages of the virus in chicken embryo cells, cultivated at a slightly lower temperature. This subtle pressure spurred the virus to evolve. The additional domestication process worked wonders, smoothing out the remaining rough edges. The resulting new strain, initially designated Edmonds-Moritane, later renamed due to its milder virulence, achieved a perfect equilibrium. A single inoculation conferred robust lifelong immunity in over 95% of recipients, while toxicity was markedly reduced. The Enders strain, subsequently renamed Moritane due to its more pronounced attenuation. This represented a perfect equilibrium, sufficient potency to confer robust lifelong immunity in over 90-5% of recipients with a single dose, substantially diminished virulence, markedly reducing side effects like fever and rashes, safety sufficient for administration without adjunct gamma globulin. This was the elegant single-dose vaccine the world had long awaited. In 1968, Schillermann's further attenuated vaccine received marketing approval, elevating this breakthrough to perfection. The toolkit was finally complete. After millennia of suffering, humanity had acquired its shield within laboratories in Boston and Pennsylvania. This silent forging declared, whether the plague could be ended was no longer the question. Whether society possessed the will to end it was the crux. By the mid-1962, the weapon lay upon the negotiating table. The United States possessed an effective live-virus vaccine, yet measles persisted stubbornly. Though accessible, the vaccine remained underutilized, with vaccination rates patchy, ad hoc, and chaotic. Hundreds of thousands of cases were still reported annually, leaving thousands of children with brain damage or deafness, and hundreds dead. This preventable disease remained unprevented. Against this backdrop, in 1966, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, made a bold declaration. Under the leadership of Director Dr. David Sensor, the agency announced a new national goal: not control, not reduction, but eradication. This meant completely eliminating all indigenous chains of measles transmission within the United States. They planned to achieve this by the end of 1967. Many deemed the objective preposterous, an example of American hubris. Eradicating any disease is a monumental task at the time. Smallpox was the only disease with any hope of global elimination. Declaring war on a contagion like measles, viewed as a routine, unavoidable rite of passage, seemed preposterous. It was akin to declaring war on the common cold, yet Sensor and his team were resolute. They devised a strategy: achieve herd immunity through vaccination while rigorously preventing imported cases. To declare war on measles, a highly contagious disease whose pathogen was regarded as an inevitable rite of passage, was utterly preposterous. It was akin to declaring war on the common cold, yet Sensor and his team remained resolute, devising a multi-pronged strategy, a three-pronged offensive combining epidemiology, large scale logistics, and public persuasion on an unprecedented scale. This was a public health war. The first phase was intelligence gathering to defeat the enemy. One must first know its whereabouts. The CDC established a comprehensive national surveillance system, requiring all clinics and hospitals to immediately report every measles case. Data converged in Atlanta, forming a real-time dynamic epidemic map. They could anticipate outbreaks and track the virus's migration. This marked a shift from passive acceptance to active pursuit. The spectre would no longer remain hidden. The second phase was the offensive itself, a federally funded mass vaccination campaign. The objective was universal vaccination by the end of 1967. To many, this goal seemed preposterous, bordering on American hubris. Eradicating any disease is a monumental task, and, at that time, smallpox was the only candidate with any hope of global elimination. Declaring war on measles, a disease long regarded as an inevitable part of life, seemed utterly preposterous, akin to waging war on the common cold. Yet Sensor and his team, and outbreak maps, they could witness outbreaks emerging and track the virus's migration patterns. This signaled a strategic shift from passive defense to active pursuit. The spectre could no longer remain hidden. The second element was the offensive itself, a massive, federally funded vaccination campaign. The goal was to rapidly build herd immunity among children to a critical threshold where the virus would die out for lack of susceptible host. The government invested millions in vaccine procurement and supported health departments in administering shots, elevating public health into a grand logistical endeavor. Vaccine stockpiles, cold-chain transport systems, community outreach programs, school gymnasiums, church basements, and community centers transformed into vaccination stations. The defining sound of that era was the mechanical thud of jet injectors, pneumatic devices that would only gradually fade from use by the late 20th century. Public health thus became a monumental logistical endeavor. Vaccine stockpiles, cold minus chain transport systems, outreach programs, school halls, church basements, and community centers all became makeshift clinics. The background hum of that era was the mechanical thud of jet injectors, pneumatic devices that propelled vaccines needle minus free through the skin. Teams of nurses could vaccinate hundreds of children within an hour. These were the tools for building herd immunity, the machinery erecting a barrier of antibodies for entire generations. Yet guns and data were useless without public buy-in. The third front was the battle of persuasion. The CDC launched a comprehensive public information campaign to reshape Americans' understanding of measles. Generations had embraced a fatalistic view. Everyone gets it better to catch it young. The new messaging overturned this notion, redefining measles as a severe and potentially fatal disease. Posters featured beaming children alongside the slogan, "They've had the measles vaccine." Booklets detailed alarming statistics. 1 in every 1,000 cases would trigger encephalitis, brain swelling causing convulsions, deafness, or intellectual impairment, with 1 to 2 deaths per 1,000. The message was stark and powerful. 1 in 1,000 cases develops encephalitis, brain swelling causing convulsions, deafness or intellectual impairment, 1 to 2 deaths per 1,000. The message was clear, direct and uncompromising. This campaign pitted data, a minus-driven, rational fear against complacency, striving to transform vaccines from optional extras into urgent necessities, the sensible choice for every responsible parent. Ultimately, the campaign secured legislative backing. As federal momentum grew, states enacted a simple yet powerful new rule: no vaccination, no school. The law mandated proof of measles vaccination before children could enroll. This masterstroke transformed vaccination from a personal medical choice into a prerequisite for public education, a civic duty. The school mandate filled vaccination gaps, covering forgotten, procrastinating, or skeptical cohorts. The 1967 eradication target proved overly ambitious. The virus was cunning, the land vast, yet the results were staggering. Nearly 500,000 measles cases were reported before the 1966 eradication doctrine commenced by 1968. A mere 2 years later, the figure had plummeted to just over 2,000 cases, reduction exceeding 95%. The chart tells its story through a precipitously falling curve, a curve representing hundreds of thousands of children spared from illness, thousands of hospital beds left empty, and countless lives not taken. This campaign persisted into the 1972, becoming a protracted and arduous eradication effort. With the introduction of the improved Schiller-Mann vaccine in 1968, the final line of defense was established. Epidemic response teams swiftly deployed to every area, reporting clusters of cases, isolating patients, and vaccinating all contacts to build an immunity barrier and sever the chain of transmission. By the decade's end, measles ceased to be a rite of passage in childhood, becoming a rare disease, though not achieved within the impossible timeline. This audacious goal ultimately fulfilled its ultimate mission. Through an unprecedented mobilization of science, logistics, and political will, the scourge of childhood was utterly vanquished. The silence in pediatric wards became the new melody of victory. The colossal vessel of public health is often propelled by silent revolutions within logistics. The birth of the measles vaccine was a seismic breakthrough, akin to a bolt from the blue. Yet what followed was the slow, steadfast engineering of transforming this miracle into the norm of childhood development. By the late 1960s, children in developed nations were shielded from measles, polio, diphtheria, tetanus, and whooping cough. Young immune systems were being educated. Yet vaccination schedules grew congested. Each disease required a separate vaccine, sometimes involving multiple injections. This triumph was evolving into a challenge of human behavior. Enter Maurice Shellman, a man who embodied blunt pragmatism and efficiency. A son of Montana farmland, Shellman brought this practical spirit to Merck Laboratories, renowned for his coarse language, irascible temper, and exacting standards. He became the most prolific vaccine ISD of the 20th century, developing over 40 vaccines and conservatively saving more lives than any other scientist in history. The most prolific vaccine ISD of the 20th century. He developed over 40 vaccines, conservatively estimated to have saved more lives than any scientist in history. He viewed the chaotic vaccination schedule as maddeningly inefficient. Why administer 3 separate injections to children in 3 separate visits when it could be done in one? The concept of a combined vaccine represented the holy grail, a single shot against multiple threats. Yet biological complexity made it a formidable challenge. One couldn't simply mix live, attenuated viruses and expect miracles. The immune system operates competitively. One virus might suppress another, leaving a child immune to one disease, yet vulnerable to 2 others. This viral interference was the core puzzle Hillman needed to solve. A combination vaccine must be a perfectly balanced biological contract, like a delicate negotiation within the syringe. Each attenuated virus must trigger lasting immunity without suppressing its neighbors. The birth of this masterpiece began in the Hillman household. In 1963, his 5-year-old daughter, Uriel Lynn, awoke with swollen lymph nodes after contracting mumps. As a pragmatic scientist, Shillman first comforted his daughter before driving to the laboratory to fetch swabs. Upon returning home, he collected a throat sample from her, a painful procedure that ultimately yielded the Uriel Lynn strain for the mumps vaccine. This highly effective and safe vaccine variant originated when the pragmatic scientist first comforted his daughter, then drove to the laboratory to retrieve swabs. Upon returning home, he collected a throat swab sample from her, a process that caused the child immense distress. This sample ultimately became the MMR vaccine's MMR strain, whose efficacy and safety remained the global gold standard to this day. He had already secured a second component, a measles vaccine based on Enders and Peebles. Research. The third was a rubella German measles vaccine. Rubella infection during pregnancy can cause catastrophic congenital defects in the fetus, deafness, blindness, heart disease, and severe intellectual disability. During the 1960–1965 rubella epidemic, thousands of infants in the United States alone developed congenital rubella syndrome. Shillman's team developed a highly effective and stable rubella vaccine. Thus, the cornerstone for the measles-mumps-rubella MMR vaccine was laid. The Shillman team developed a highly effective and stable rubella vaccine. By this point, he had mastered vaccines for measles, mumps, and rubella. Subsequent work exemplified rigorous scientific methodology through sophisticated attenuation techniques. Each virus was weakened using distinct cell cultures. Measles and mumps viruses were cultivated in chicken embryo cells, while the rubella virus was grown in human diploid cells. This process resembled the gradual domestication of wild animals, with each generation of passage rendering the virus less virulent until it was no longer pathogenic, yet still recognizable by the immune system, which learned to combat the live virus. The Shillman team tirelessly tested dosages and combinations until they found the perfect equilibrium where the 3 viruses coexisted without interference, each performing its designated function. After years of painstaking, arduous research, they achieved success. In 1971, the measles-mumps-rubella MMR vaccine was approved for market release, yielding immediate and profound impact. For parents, it represented a miracle of convenience, say single injection, protecting against 3 childhood threats. For public health officials, it was a logistical dream, streamlining vaccination procedures, reducing clinic visits, and boosting immunization coverage. Encouraging parents to bring their children for one vaccination proved far easier than 3 or 4, causing vaccination rates to soar. MR represented not merely a new vaccine, but an entirely new approach to vaccination, transforming a series of hurdles into a single, manageable step. In countries adopting the vaccine, cases of all three diseases plummeted. Severe birth defects like congenital rubella syndrome became rare, and mumps-related deafness and infertility vanished from pediatric wards. Measles, the king of death, was driven to the brink of extinction in developed nations. Maurice Shellman, the rugged son of a Montana farmer, not only conquered three ancient plagues, but distilled their defeat into an elegant and potent syringe. By making the right choice, the easy choice, he solved a profoundly human dilemma. The profound success of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine in developed nations not only transformed vaccination from a series of hurdles into a manageable single step, but also tamed three ancient plagues, distilling this victory into an elegant and potent vaccine. By making the right choice, the easy choice, he solved a profoundly human dilemma. The tremendous success of the mRNA vaccine in Europe and America casts a shadow over the rest of the world. By the late 20th century, a stark divide emerged. In wealthy nations, measles had become a tale told by grandmothers, yet across Africa, Asia, and parts of South America, it remained an ever-present reality, like a seasonal predator. It claimed nearly 1 million young lives annually, becoming the world's leading preventable killer of children. A preventable killer of children. The world possessed the perfect tool to end this carnage. The safe, effective, and affordable vaccine. Yet the logistical chasm between having the tool and achieving vaccination seemed insurmountable. This was not a failure of science, but a failure of will, infrastructure, and equity. Such stark disparities gave birth to the most ambitious public health initiative in history. In 2001, global health organizations joined forces to declare, enough. The American Red Cross, United Nations Foundation, U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, UNICEF, and WHO jointly launched the Measles Initiative, later renamed the Measles-Rubella Initiative. Its objective was audacious: have global measles deaths within 4 years. This unprecedented declaration of war targeted a single virus, spanning dozens of nations and diverse cultures. This campaign relied not on armies, but on refrigerators, syringes, and thousands of health workers. Its strategy employed a simple, elegant 3-step model: catch-up vaccination, sustained vaccination, and follow-up. This approach recognized that addressing the present was as crucial as preparing for the future. The first phase, catch-up vaccination, functioned like an all-out offensive campaign. It not only tackled future problems, but also responded to immediate crises. The first phase, catch-up vaccination, resembles a large scale frontal assault during national vaccination campaigns. All children aged 9 months to 15 years, regardless of prior vaccination history, are included in the immunization scope. This aims to rapidly close immunity gaps, immediately eliminating vast populations of vulnerable children. The scale is staggering. Envision vaccination teams in remote Ethiopian or Bangladeshi villages setting up makeshift stations under tree-shaded schoolhouses or marketplaces, temporary posts directed beside markets. Within days, they inoculate hundreds, even thousands, of children. They guarded a fragile cold, chainless refrigerated supply line stretching from factories across oceans, and along rugged dirt roads to critical outposts must remain unbroken. Should the chain falter, even a slight rise in temperature would render the vaccines ineffective. Such scenes were repeated tens of thousands of times across sub-Saharan Africa. In the first 5 years of the program, over 200 million children were vaccinated. Yet this blitzkrieg was merely the beginning. The more arduous second phase involved the slow, mundane labor of establishing permanent defenses. The goals to strengthen routine immunization systems, ensuring every infant received measles vaccinations through regular healthcare services, typically around their first birthday. This entailed training nurses, guaranteeing stable vaccine supplies for rural clinics, establishing reliable health records, and conducting community health education. It was a national endeavor. The final stage involved follow-up monitoring. Planners were acutely aware of the practical challenges. There would always be gaps. Villages cut off by floods, clinics short of supplies, families on the move. Thus, every 2 to 4 years, catch-up vaccination campaigns swept across the country, vaccinating children born since the last line-of-scale effort who had missed routine immunization. This 3-1 strategy forms a safety net, first covering the vast majority through large scale operations, then capturing the stragglers through smaller systems. The results are remarkable. Initial targets were not merely met but shattered. Between 2000 and 2007, global measles death plummeted by 74%. In hard-hit regions like Africa, the decline approached 90%. Hundreds of thousands of children who would otherwise have perished survived. This triumph of global collaboration and logistical prowess was nothing short of miraculous. Yet the battle is far from over. The virus has demonstrated remarkable resilience. In hard-hit regions like Africa, the decline approached 90%. Hundreds of thousands of children who would otherwise have perished survived. This triumph of global collaboration and logistical prowess was nothing short of miraculous. Yet the battle is far from over. The virus has demonstrated remarkable resilience. In hard-hit regions like Africa, the decline approaches 90%. Hundreds of thousands of children who would otherwise have perished have survived. This triumph of global cooperation and logistical prowess is nothing short of miraculous. Yet the battle is far from over. The virus has demonstrated remarkable resilience. In hardest-hit regions like Africa, mortality rates have fallen by nearly 90%. Hundreds of thousands of children who would otherwise have perished have survived. This extraordinary triumph of global cooperation and logistical prowess is nothing short of miraculous. Yet the battle is far from over. The measles virus is tenacious and cunning, retreating to the world's most inaccessible places. Conflict zones where healthcare workers cannot reach, unstable communities where social structures are fractured, and areas with weak infrastructure. In Afghanistan, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and elsewhere, measles continues to rage, triggering devastating outbreaks among malnourished children. The final stages of this marathon are proving the most arduous. Global action has demonstrated that measles can be conquered, reducing annual deaths from millions to sporadic cases. Yet, it has also laid bare a brutal truth. The virus cares not for borders or ceasefires. As long as hiding places remain, as long as unvaccinated communities exist, it waits patiently for its chance to return. This global measles war is vast in scale, a narrative of millions, a logistical campaign spanning continents. Yet such grand narratives often obscure the virus's darker, more intimate, more terrifying truth. For most infected children, it is merely a brief ordeal, a week of fever, rash, cough, after which survivors gain lifelong immunity. Victory in this battle is often decided within days. Yet for a tragically small minority of survivors, the virus never truly departs, merely retreating to the body's most secure bastion, the central nervous system. There it lies dormant for 5, 10, or even more years, biding its time. When it reawakens, it no longer manifests as an acute illness, but as a slow, irreversible, and fatal assault upon the brain. This terrifying sequelae is known as subacute sclerosing panencephalitis SSPE. SSPE stands among medicine's most cruel and tragic afflictions. It is neither a viral reinfection nor a simple complication, but a persistent, chronic plague triggered by a defective measles virus. This covert sanctuary is established by a mutated measles virus incapable of assembling new viral particles for explosive spread. It instead creeps like a spectre along neural pathways, eroding slowly. It assaults neighboring cells directly from within one brain cell, evading detection by the immune system. The immune defenses remain oblivious to the enemy, lurking within the command center. For years, the child appears perfectly healthy, attending school, playing, growing. as childhood memories of illness gradually fade. Then, without warning, decline creeps in. Initial symptoms are subtle, easily misdiagnosed as other conditions, often beginning with subtle personality shifts. A once lively, cheerful child becomes withdrawn, irritable, and emotionally flat. Academic performance declines. Movements grow increasingly clumsy, with frequent stumbling or dropping of objects. Teachers note distractibility, while parents may attribute it to adolescent pressures or adjustment difficulties. Yet these changes do not cease instead. They persist in a slow, systematic deterioration. This marks the first stage, covert cognitive and behavioral decline. The child begins experiencing myoclonic jerks, sudden, violent muscle spasms. Initially, these may manifest as simple nodding movements, but they progressively escalate into full-minus body convulsions, often resulting in loss of consciousness as the defective virus silently spreads through the brain. It destroys everything. The child loses fundamental abilities. Walking capacity vanishes. Speech becomes slurred before being lost entirely. Violent convulsions throughout the body frequently induce loss of consciousness. The defective virus silently ravages the brain, destroying everything. The child loses fundamental abilities. Walking capacity vanishes. Speech becomes slurred before ceasing entirely, and assistance is required for eating and dressing. The former self is being erased neuron by neuron. Cognitive functions disintegrate, descending into chaos before complete absence of consciousness. Intellectual decline accelerates like a free fall. The body remains while the mind has perished. The disease then progresses to its third and fourth stages, whose brain damage becomes widespread. Convulsions may diminish. The child's body stiffens, limbs locked in unnatural postures. They gradually slip into a vegetative state, ultimately falling into a coma. Throughout this period, vital functions, heartbeat, respiration remain sustained by the brainstem, the final part of the central nervous system to be eroded. The end invariably comes from secondary complications such as pneumonia or heart failure. From the first subtle symptoms to the final breath, this process may last 1 to 3 years. Though some endure a longer struggle, it is a slow neurological execution. Most horrific, there is no cure, no remedy. Once SPE symptoms manifest, the disease course is irreversible, and the outcome is invariably death, without exception, though rare, occurring in approximately 1 in 10,000 natural measles cases, with higher incidence among infants contracting the disease before their first birthday. Its rarity in no way diminishes its terror, rather, that renders it all the more dreadful. SSPE stands as the ultimate, silent rebuttal to the myth that measles is a gentle rite of passage. It is the spectre lurking within the feast of natural immunity. The rash, fever, and cough are merely the virus's overture. Its true destructive potential far exceeds imagination, planting a silent, ticking time bomb within the bodies of the few survivors. Herein lies the true significance of the Hillman triple vaccine. The measles minus mumps minus rubella vax not only prevents acute illness, pneumonia, encephalitis, and deafness, but also halts this catastrophe, ensuring the defective virus never establishes its lethal, hidden stronghold within the brain. Each dose is not merely a shield against a week's illness, but a force that eradicates a decade-minus-long nightmare before it can take root. Medicine's greatest triumphs are those silent preventions, the tragedies that never unfolded, the slow descent into darkness halted by routine vaccination. Subacute sclerosing polyencephalomyelitis (SP) is a horror story most of us, thanks to modern vaccines, will never need to read. The work of Maurice Schillerman and John Enders wrought miracles for humanity, erecting a shield against childhood killers. By the late 1992s, in the comfortable developed world, the shield had faded into the background, taken for granted like clean water. The MMR vaccine was routinely administered to young children, and the horrors of dark rooms, feverish cries, and tiny graves had long faded from memory. It had become a ghost of modern life, as taken for granted as clean water. The measles, mumps, Rubella vaccine was routinely injected into young children, and the terrors of dark rooms, feverish cries, and tiny graves had faded from memory. It has become a ghost story, a chapter forever sealed in history books. Measles has been conquered, yet within this silent vacuum of victory, on this fertile ground of complacency, a new disease quietly took root. It did not originate in overcrowded slums, but was born at a press conference in a renowned London hospital in February 1998. It germinated quietly at that hospital press conference. In February 1998, the storm center was gastroenterologist Andrew Wakefield. He spoke with polished confidence, professing concern. This lone truth minus seeker a solitary figure confronting a vast system. His research, published in the authoritative medical journal The Lancet, was based solely on a case series of 12 children. According to Wakefield, these 12 children shared a unique and alarming experience. Parents reported that the children had been developing normally, but shortly after receiving the measles, mumps and rubella MMR vaccine, they suddenly developed chronic bowel problems and rapidly deteriorated into autism. Wakefield claimed to have discovered a new syndrome, autism enterocolitis, and pointed the finger at measles. At a press conference, he advised parents to opt for single-dose vaccines rather than the a combination vaccine. This recommendation resonated globally like a pebble dropped into a tranquil lake, sending ripples that persisted for decades. The problem was, this pebble was a fraud. The entire narrative was a meticulously constructed fraud. The truth behind the scenes was that Wakefield's research was not a noble pursuit of truth. He was employed by British solicitor Richard Bull, who was recruiting plaintiffs for a lawsuit against MMR vaccine manufacturers. Wakefield's task was to provide the medical evidence, the key piece of evidence that would make the lawsuit viable. The 12 children were meticulously selected from families already involved in legal action. This was the crux of the matter, and it was merely the beginning. The study itself was a disaster. With only 12 children and no control group, it scarcely constituted scientific argumentation, let alone proved causation. Yet Wakefield not only relied on flawed methodology, but actively fabricated data. Investigative journalist Brian subsequently spent years cross-referencing statements in the Lancet paper against the children's actual medical record, uncovering shocking fraud. Children with developmental issues predating a vaccination were presented as previously healthy cases. Timelines were manipulated to fit the narrative, and what was described as a novel intestinal disorder was in most cases normal intestinal misdiagnosed or deliberately misreported. Even more egregious were the treatment methods inflicted upon the children to gather evidence. Wakefield subjected these vulnerable patients to invasive, painful, and medically unnecessary procedures. Lumbar punctures, colonoscopies, and MRI scans. None of these interventions received proper ethical approval, as they were based on a hypothesis fabricated for financial gain. This constituted not merely a betrayal of medical duty, but a trampling of trust, all for legal stratagems and personal gain. Long before his Lancet paper, Wakefield had patented a monovalent measles vaccine, a product destined to make him immensely wealthy should public confidence in the MMR combined vaccine be destroyed. Yet the public remained utterly unaware. They saw only the concerned doctor on television and sensational headlines. Controversy minus hungry media amplified the story with suffocating fervor. The narrative was perfect. The brave dissenter versus the ruthless pharmaceutical giant. Fear of autism, a complex and poorly understood condition, became a powerful emotional driver, rather than accept the uncertain explanations offered by genetics and neuroscience. People preferred the simplistic demonization of vaccines, the uncertainties of genetics and neuroscience, the measured, cautious responses of the global scientific community. Word round out by the clamourer, they spoke in the language of epidemiology, of large scale statistical analyses and statistically significant studies. They clarified, no link between the measles rubella vaccine and autism had been found in colossal studies involving millions of children. Yet press releases and academic papers could not compete with the visual imagery of weeping mothers and doctors offering simple, terrifying answers. Lies a simple and sensational, truth is complex and statistical. In the court of public opinion, truth has never stood a chance. The seeds of doubt were sown, and thus the modern anti-vaccination movement that spec to haunting medical progress gave birth to its founding myth, its sacred text, and its first martyr, childhood plagues, once on the brink of extinction, quietly gathered strength for a resurgence. The aftershocks had barely rippled before dissipating. Truth has never stood a chance in the court of public opinion. The seeds of doubt were sown, and thus the modern anti-vaccination movement that spec to haunting medical progress gave birth to its founding myth, sacred text, and first martyr. Childhood plagues, once nearing extinction, were quietly gathering strength for a resurgence. The aftershocks had barely subsided when the truth, in the court of public opinion, had never stood a chance. The seeds of doubt had been sown, and thus the modern anti-vaccination movement, this spectre haunting medical progress, gained its founding myth, its sacred text, and its first martyr. The childhood plague, once on the brink of extinction, is quietly gathering strength for a resurgence. The consequences are not immediate, but unfold as a slow motion catastrophe. The plague of fear spreading through households, playgrounds, and across oceans. Once unleashed, the idea proved more contagious than the virus it claimed to expose. In Britain, the first nation to suffer, measles mumps rubella vaccination rates began to decline from a secure 90% in the mid-1990 seconds to a perilous 80% by 2004. In parts of London, rates even dipped below 60%. This collective dismantling of a public health achievement unfolded silently, beginning with each anxious parent. Those decisions, born of love and fear, seemed insignificant, yet collectively tore apart the invisible shield of herd immunity. This concept, beautiful yet fragile in public health, establishes a protective firewall when sufficient numbers are vaccinated, safeguarding everyone, especially the most vulnerable. It shelters newborns too young for their first dose, protects patients with chemotherapy-induced skin burns, newborns not yet at age for their first dose, chemotherapy patients whose immune systems are already crippled, organ transplant recipients. They rely on the community's immune barrier for shelter, yet the firewall's strength hinges on its weakest link. When vaccination rates decline, the embers of old diseases seep through the cracks, affecting those with failing immune systems, the elderly, and transplant recipients. They rely on community immunity for protection, yet the strength of this firewall is only as strong as its weakest link. When vaccination rates decline, the embers of old diseases can seep through the cracks. Measles, with its ferocious contagiousness, is like a wildfire that needs only the smallest opening to become a raging blaze. The first major outbreak ignited in Dublin, Ireland, in 2000, influenced by the Wakefield scare. Vaccination rates plummeted, culminating in a catastrophic measles outbreak. Over 500 confirmed cases, more than 100 hospitalizations, and the tragic deaths of 3 children. This epidemic laid bare the true nature of measles, far from a mild rash. It is a deadly killer requiring theoretical and debate-driven justification. Following this catastrophic outbreak, over 500 individuals were infected. More than 100 were hospitalized, and 3 children died. This epidemic brutally exposed measles' true nature, setting aside theoretical debates. It is no harmless rash, but a deadly killer. Britain soon followed. After formally eliminating indigenous measles, the nation experienced a shocking resurgence of the disease. Between 2012 and 2013, Swansea in Wales experienced a large scale outbreak, with over 200 people falling ill and dozens hospitalized. This was the inevitable consequence for the cohort of children who had refused or delayed the vaccination a decade earlier. The spectre had returned to its former hunting grounds. Yet fear and viruses recognize no national borders. Wakefield's debunked theory amplified online became a global phenomenon. By 2010, His medical license had been revoked in Britain, and the Lancet formally retracted his paper, declaring it a complete fraud. Yet this mattered little. In America, he was hailed as a persecuted hero. His rhetoric resonated among celebrities and health gurus, spreading through forums and blogs before exploding on social media. The consequences unfolded city by city in public health records. In 2014, this perfect symbol of regression struck in the most ironic of places, Disneyland. The happiest place on Earth became the epicenter of a multi-state measles outbreak. A single infected visitor, likely from a country where measles remains endemic, mingled with crowds containing a critical mass of unvaccinated individuals. The resulting viral spark spread across California and 6 other states, infecting 20 people. America had formally declared measles eliminated into Thousand Dale, a mock achievement now reignited within a theme park, revealing the fragile nature of such victories. A chapter unfolded in Minnesota in 2017. Wakefield and his associates deliberately targeted the state's large Somali immigrant community, holding meetings and distributing leaflets to stoke fears that these children are particularly vulnerable to vaccine injuries, exploiting language barriers that hindered access to complex healthcare systems. They capitalized on legitimate community concerns about high autism rates, minus immigrant communities in the US. They organized rallies and distributed leaflets, stoking fears that Somali children are vulnerable to vaccine harm, exploiting the language barriers faced by these groups within the complex healthcare system. They capitalized on genuine community concerns about high autism rates. This disinformation campaign proved remarkably effective. Our vaccination rates among Somali-American toddlers in Minnesota plummeted from over 90% to just over 40%. The result was the state's most severe measles outbreak in decades. 70-5 individuals contracted the disease, the majority being unvaccinated. Somali-American children. Over 20 required hospitalization. This served as a laboratory-perfect demonstration of the real-world harm wrought by Wakefield's falsehoods, targeting communities with misinformation, eroding vaccine confidence, and allowing disease to resurge. Yet the most devastating case unfolded on the other side of the globe, in the Pacific island nation of Samoa. In 2019, the tragic finale of Wakefield's fraud unfolded there. A year after a nurse mistakenly mixed the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine with a muscle relaxant instead of sterile water, killing 2 infants and shattering public confidence. Anti-vaccination groups from Australia, New Zealand, and the United States promptly flooded local social media with propaganda claiming vaccines cause disease, fueling panic. The government was compelled to suspend the MMR vaccination program. By the time it resumed, the disaster was already inevitable. Anti-vaccination groups from Australia, New Zealand and the United States disseminated propaganda across the nation's social media platforms, attributing blame to the vaccines themselves and amplifying public alarm. The government promptly suspended the MMR vaccination program. By the time the program resumed, the damage was done. Public panic had taken hold and vaccination rates plummeted to a catastrophic 31%. In October 2019, a measles outbreak struck. In a nation with virtually no herd immunity, the virus spread with terrifying speed and efficiency. Like wildfire in a parched forest, the government declared a state of emergency, closing schools and banning public gatherings. Officials desperately urged unvaccinated families to hang red cloth or flags outside their homes so mobile medical teams could locate them. Schools were closed and public gatherings banned. To urgently advance vaccinations, officials required unvaccinated households to display scarlet cloth or red flags for mobile medical teams to locate. The island became dotted with these fragile crimson signals, yet for too many, it was already too late. Hospitals overflowed with critically ill children. The final toll, heartbreaking. Over 5,000 cases and 80-3 deaths in a nation of just 200,000. 70-2 of those were children under 5. 80 lives lost to a wholly preventable disease. This tragedy stemmed directly from lies spun for profit in a London office 2 decades prior. A conquered disease had returned with undiminished ferocity. Thus we found ourselves in the 21st century, fighting a war we thought we had already won. The battle against measles now rages onto distinct, yet interconnected fronts an unfinished war. A persistent silent struggle against both the biological virus and the viral spread of misinformation. The most remote, medically underserved communities, the battle for the cold chain. The challenge lies in maintaining millions of vaccine doses at precise sub-0 temperatures, transported by aeroplane, jeep, motorbike, and finally on foot to children in the dusty villages of sub-Saharan Africa or makeshift clinics in Bangladeshi refugee camps. This is the heroic resolve of organizations like the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and GAVI. They carry forward the spirit of John Enders and Maurice Heller, battling viruses on battlefields where medical infrastructure is fragile and political turmoil is ever present. In 2019, the year of Samoa's tragedy, global measles deaths still exceeded 140, overwhelmingly children in developing nations. For them, the true threat was not the 1998 fraudulent paper, but the stark denial of access to life-saving vaccines. This is both a battle for resources and a contest of political will, a struggle to deliver a vial of hope through the resistance of poverty and conflict. Another battlefield is more covert, more insidious, more difficult to conquer. This campaign is not fought in clinics, but online. It is a war against misinformation, waged through social media feeds, private group chats, and YouTube comment sections. Here, the enemy is not the rubella virus, but the very architecture of the modern internet, a structure meticulously engineered to propagate fear and suspicion. The same algorithms that recommend songs or footwear can steer anxious new parents into the abyss of anti-vaccination propaganda, where sensational anecdotes and polished videos, true or false, often prove more compelling and shareable than the CDC's meticulous report. On this battlefield, Andrew Wakefield's lies, long debunked and retracted, continue to mutate and proliferate with each share and repost. Though struck off the medical register and stripped of his mainstream scientific career, he has achieved a form of digital immortality. The difficulty of this digital wall lies not in date, but in trust. Wakefield's fraud constitutes a deliberate undermining of public health's foundations, destroying trust between doctors and patients, and between citizens and research institutions. The movement he incited thrives precisely by feeding this mistrust, portraying public health officials as corporate lackeys, doctors as ignorant pawns, and the entire scientific consensus as a vast conspiracy. Rebuilding trust is a slow and arduous endeavor. It demands longer, more empathetic conversations between doctors and hesitant parents. It requires scientists to become better communicators, stepping out of laboratories into public forums. It calls on all of us to become more critical consumers of information, learning to distinguish credible sources from alluring falsehoods. The complete history of measles, from the ancient physicians who first described it to the modern programmers who write algorithms spreading lies, carries the full story of vaccination. We have witnessed the world before the shield emerged. When disease was an inescapable, often fatal rite of passage, we have witnessed the astonishing triumph of vaccines, a testament to human ingenuity and perseverance that has saved and continues to save hundreds of millions of lives. Now we witness the consequences of complacency, when fear obscures reason, when folded fancies devours historical lessons. The resurgence of measles in affluent nations serves as a stark warning. Complacency is the most perilous by-product of success. When vaccines prove so effective that diseases vanish from view, we forget the fear they once inspired. In the absence of that fear creates fertile ground for fear of the vaccines themselves. The battle against measles is not over, nor will it ever be. It demands perpetual vigilance. Viruses are patiently lurk within the unvaccinated, waiting to exploit cracks in our collective defenses, awaiting moments of doubt. The fading of trust. The story of measles starkly reminds us Scientific victories are not eternal. They are not monuments, but fragile gardens requiring constant tending. Safeguarding them requires not only syringes and refrigerators, but education, empathy, clear communication, and above all memory. We must remember the dim wards, the wrenching coughs, the tiny graves, for measles never forgets. Should we grow complacent, it will seize its chance, etching all this anew into our very blood. When this silent tale rolls to a close, you need do nothing more. If you have fallen asleep, may this quiet hour gently linger through the night. If you remain awake, rest here if you wish, wherever your heart may lead.